Okay. This is welcome to the second in the series of global language-based area studies talks. This has been a paper which has taken some adjustments on our part because it was originally scheduled for the Wednesday, which is a strike day. It is also a hybrid event, which we haven't done really in the past. So I'm grateful to all of you who are present. I can see there's actually two John Morgans here. So we're grateful to John Morgan for increasing the audience considerably. We are going to have with us today Helen Drake, who is the director of the Institute for Diplomacy and International Governance at Loughborough University in London, who is also professor of European and French Studies, previously at the East Midlands campus, and Helen teaches postgraduate studies and is developing a collective research agenda linking different dimensions of diplomacy. We've known Helen for many years. She was linked to the old school European studies, has produced an amazing research, and today is going to be talking to us about Brexit. I'll just tell you that in the room today with us, we have Nick Parsons, who will be familiar to many of you, and also David Clark who is the head of school, and Kate Barbara, who is quite keen to get going. But, so on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Helen, who will speak for about 20 minutes or so. Brexit. Okay.
Thank you. I think we've got an echo. Can you hear me online? Maybe somebody could do a thumbs up or something. Can I just check? Can you hear me online, please? I'm not sure if it'll hear me because I could send it, couldn't I? Yeah. Oh, so somebody said yes. Okay, hello everyone. And thank you very much, Gordon, for inviting. And yeah, it did seem a bit of a miracle that I got here in the end, but with strikes of all kinds. Anyway, so let me just start with a bit of background, since I'm here, I believe, in a modern languages department. So it's a bit sort of my home, really, spiritually. So I think, I'm not sure, like you, Gordon, maybe I do come from a tradition of area studies, more specifically European studies, in fact. I began my career as a linguist, French and German, with a specialism in international relations and then management. In other words, I was actually one of those lucky linguists. Again, I don't know if that was the same with you, Gordon, who in the 1980s, all that time ago, I was really lucky to find consecutive happy homes in universities that catered to linguists who wanted to apply their languages to something other than literary criticism, which is like probably my weak spot or even my blind spot as I was doing my studies. And so after a brief foray into the mysterious world of international marketing, I found my way back, got a lucky break into academia. And there is a point to this, I'm getting to it very soon. And I found myself needing to evolve, or maybe to morph as a scholar, to keep pace with UK academic fashion and career opportunities. Hence, I find myself now in my most recent research, my most recent, if you like, academic incarnation, which I'm really thrilled about, is in diplomacy. And I think I realized last year that that's what I really would have liked to have done as a career, been a career diplomat, but I didn't realize that in my 20s. And diplomatic studies is usually deemed to be a subset, I think, of IR, of international relations. And I think I'm trying to fashion sort of my own perspective on the field, and starting with a domain that's close to both my heart and my head, namely the Franco-British bilateral relationship, or FBBR. By the way, I haven't got PowerPoint, in case you think I'm just sort of so ancient that I forgot to launch it. I'm not doing PowerPoint this evening. So as I said, the FBBR for short sort of engages my head and my heart. So my head, it's a fairly obvious case of a bilateral relationship with plenty of scope for exploration. So the Franco-British relationship operates at several levels of governance. From the very top, the sort of the summit tree that we see, there's due to be one next year, unless there are more falling outs and sort of instability at the top on either side. So the relationship incorporates levels of governance from the very top to local levels of cooperation, such as, very timely, across the Straits of Dover, so relations between the Kent and the Nord-Pas-de-Calais. And of course, over 4 decades, there were the shared routines of the shared routines and practices of shared EU membership. These are also relations that involve numerous actors. We think of diplomacy, we think it's just the state, we think it's just the government, but really it's by no means limited to them. So staying with the example of the Channel, there's many NGOs involved. These are relations that span numerous policy sectors. So a lot of the research on France and Britain, Franco-British relations, tends to be about the history. There is a deep history, and also on security and defence. But the relations span industrial cooperation, think of Concord, more recently Sizewell C, the Channel Tunnel itself, culture. In the thick of Brexit, the Bayeux Tapestry, and it found itself loaned to the UK, whether that means anything. And of course, as I said, the relationship spans many centuries. So there's great scholarship really in the area. So still talking about my head, it's an area where I like to think I've got a few tools with which to conduct the research, not only the linguistic expertise, but also the softer research skills, which in my book make research worthwhile, or at least meaningful and enjoyable. I'm thinking of networks and collaborators. So the published article on the subject, my published article was with my French colleague, Professor Pauline Schnapper, who's at La Sorbonne Nouvelle, who's kind of a mirror image of me. So she knows more about Britain than I, and I probably don't know more about France than her, but that's how it looks on paper. So then came Brexit, which is where I dare to refer to my heart, or let's call it my subjectivity, which has added an interesting new layer to the research endeavour. And I could digress on, so I was chair of UACES when Brexit hit, and there was some sort of, not controversy, but there was some discussion about whether or not the Association for Contemporary European Studies should or should not take a stand on Brexit. And I didn't as chair. I mean, I didn't assume that all members felt the same way. Anyway, so there's subjectivity because Brexit is personal, as well as professional for me and political. And it's personal for the obvious reasons, which intersect with the professional, the losing of the various mobility rights that came with the EU's freedom of movement, but also, and I'm sharing this with you, sort of less obviously, the loss of at least part of the identity that I've constructed for myself pretty much ever since I fell in love with French, age 11. I have no idea why that happened, but it did. And my Twitter handle, I'm going to have to move on to another platform, is Franco-Brit. So the souring of relations between France and the UK over Brexit, of which more, right, I'll come to that, has indeed spilled over into the personal realm. It's inserted barriers, misunderstandings into what were routine interactions at many levels of life. In other words, or sort of to pursue that, and as I've discussed elsewhere, Brexit has really, because of the form it took, has really forced upon individuals as well as states and governments the taking of sides. And the constructive ambiguity that is practiced by diplomatic negotiators in conflict situations has been thwarted by the hard facts of the UK's hard Brexit. So I'm just saying that the kind of Brexit that we've ended up with has sort of been rather binary and forced us onto different sides. I mean, again, I could digress in questions. It comes down to all sorts of questions, all sorts of issues around the loss of mobility. Anyway, so you're probably dying to know how this is translated into the research itself and what I've done so far, what remains to be done, and the sort of challenges encountered. So there was an article that was published then, myself and Pauline, in JSA, the Journal of Contemporary European Research. So I'm just going to sort of, if you haven't, inexplicably, if you haven't read it, I thought I could, I could just go over some of the key findings. It's open access, by the way. So Pauline and I conducted 9 interviews over a 2-year period, 2019 to 2021, with senior officials in Paris and London, and 2 embassies, the FCDO and the Quai d'Orsay. And the part of the title of our article, "We Thought We Were Friends," was the lament of one of the UK embassy officials early on in the Brexit saga. We asked our respondents about their experience of the relationship during the 2 phases of the Brexit negotiations, it all seems like ancient history now in a kind of a very weird way, but those leading up to 2019, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and then that sort of exciting year in 2020 up to the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And we zoomed in on two specific areas of bilateral cooperation that are barely covered in the TCA. On the one hand, defence and security cooperation, and on the other, the governance of migration and mobility. Right. So we found that Brexit did indeed deliver an initial shock to the FBBR. And we define shock as, quote, a dramatic change in the international system or its subsystems that fundamentally alters the processes, relationships, and expectations that drive nation-state interactions. That was from a 1995 article by Gertz and Deal. And Gordon, I can share the article afterwards if you like, as I haven't got any PowerPoint slides. So I said then that using that definition, it dealt a shock to the relationship. You know, we tend to use words like shock, crisis, willy-nilly, but we did attempt to kind of come up with a definition and apply it. And so for example, why was it a shock or how? Well, in the early stages of the negotiations, there was like a parallel universe. So bilateral cooperation and Brexit were handled in parallel diplomatic tracks. French government departments were banned from discussing Brexit issues with their UK counterparts, and officials reported how they had to handle the relationship with care for fear of tainting the negotiations or being seen to do so. French diplomats, we learned, by and large, took an unsentimental and strategic approach to Brexit, which seemed to come as a surprise to the UK side. I feel like I should have had tattooed on my forehead, I told you so, but I haven't. So that seemed to come as a surprise to the UK side. And you may recall that France was frequently portrayed in the UK as the bad cop in the negotiations. Yeah, there's some elements of truth to that, of course, but and we found that by the time of the transition period, so in 2020, dialogue did resume between the two sides as there was a period of adjustment to the artificially split reality of conducting kind of bilateral affairs separately from Brexit. So you could say that Brexit wasn't a disruption in the sense of sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, you know, jettisoning the business model or the operating system. But our interviewees and other research told us that it was a bigger blow than Iraq 2003, which was already, a serious kind of dent to the relationship. So then we looked ahead and in more details, as I said, at defence and security and on one hand, and borders, migration and mobility on the other. So shall I just crack on? Yeah. So in the first case, defence and security, which is where quite a lot of the research goes on. That's what people understandably kind of see as important. So the 2010 bilateral Lancaster House agreements continue to function outside the EU framework, and their importance, as well as other matters, were underlined in the 2018 Sandhurst agreements signed in the thick of Brexit. So in the field of defence and security, it would appear this is still sort of terrain for new momentum in the relationship. So Peter Ricketts, for example, he's former lots of things actually, but former ambassador, include amongst other things, sort of on record as saying we need a new momentum and you need a new elan in defence and security, and sort of moving ahead of it. So we've tried to do some more research, but I'll come back to the problems with that. So sort of in the current day, some would say that the response to the war in Ukraine has to some extent provided scope for kind of a new reset. Some of the diplomats talk about reset of the relationship in this field, defence and security. And then you have President Macron's own strategies, the European Intervention Initiative, and more recently, the European Political Community, okay, both of which have seen UK participation. So, and I'm really kind of moving quickly over a lot of detail, sorry. But sort of what we argue is that there are limits to this sort of ad hoc cooperation, which both sides have been engaged in, and mini-lateral diplomacy, which is the E3, France, Britain, and Germany. So what I'm saying here is in this domain. There's plenty of scope, plenty of activity, whether you call it sort of mission-based or coalition-based. But in diplomatic terms, that tends to be perhaps less formal or institutionalized than bilateral diplomacy in the case of formerly the FBBR, or maybe the special UK-US relationship, or the Franco-German relationship. In the article, we did a comparison a bit of the three. You know, they're more likely, this sort of ad hoc diplomacy perhaps is more likely to be taken hostage by short-term political tensions. Okay. Then we looked at matters of borders, migration and mobility. Right. Well, I mean, here, I've talked a bit about mobility and I'll talk more here about borders and migration, but the problems are very obvious, aren't they? You know, Brexit by design has put the UK beyond the EU's shared regimes for border control, migration and mobility. But mobility in particular, even going back centuries, has been central to the fabric of the relationship, the chasse croisée across the Channel. For centuries, the relationship has accommodated. So I guess it will again, right? I'm not being gloom and doom, but things have changed. So interviewees, with relation to the ending of free movement, interviewees referred to, quote, the enormous shock that was dealt to the Franco-British relationship. And I mean, the necessary adjustments do go beyond sort of so-called teething problems. You know, the UK government is like to refer to teething problems to hit the cultural dimensions of the relationship, such as school trips, the need for passports, not identity cards, university staff and student exchanges and cultural exchanges more broadly. So none of this, I'm not like banging my drum, well, not now, but none of this is rendered impossible by Brexit, but it's had the effect of sort of othering a once familiar partner on both sides. And it's also narrowed the options for public diplomacy on both sides. So, and I think the relationship, alongside its trading links, its commercial links, defence and security, it has been sustained, we could argue, by the ties between its two populations. So that's sort of mobility. With regards to the situation of undocumented or otherwise irregular migrants seeking to make the perilous crossing across the Channel, you will see in the headlines, you will see in the images, and I could spend a long time here, but I mean, suffice it to say that there's been lots of pre-Brexit, during Brexit and post-Brexit bilateral arrangements between France and the UK to effectively securitize the Channel, but we're yet to really see real results, however they might be defined, right? And there is still a serious governance gap that by all accounts the UK, well, you know, this is what we found, hoped would be filled by a UK-France bilateral arrangement, say around returns. But unsurprisingly, coming back to something I said earlier, France has taken sides in the sense of being bound by EU arrangements. I mean, I gave a version of this somewhere else in a Calypso Nicolaidis, she won't mind me quoting her, a French scholar. Of course the French took sides, Helen, of course they sided with Europe, like, why are you even mentioning it? But I still think, especially as there's sort of the metaphor of the Channel and taking sides, it's still quite useful, I think, to think about the fact that France in particular was, you know, you could see it. So for France, the EU remains a default diplomatic framework, whereas for the EU maybe comes across as best forgotten. And as with defence and security, but perhaps more obviously with these questions of migration, we see problems of operational governance in these matters of lives and livelihoods placed at the whim of a highly politicized issue. Or to put it another way, you know, there may well be, well, and I'll come on to that, you know, operationally, there's a lot of goodwill to make things work, but it's very much subject to the whims of an intensely politicized area. And I'm speaking here again of migration and mobility. So we concluded our research, this is still with the article, with some reflections on the relationship in particular and bilateral diplomacy in general that we want to pursue. In the case of the FBBR, we write in our conclusions sort of both parties, both sides, of course, have lost the opportunities for elite socialisation that came with shared EU membership. And just as an aside, I was talking to some Irish ambassadors last week in the Netherlands, I mean that, who talked about that, exactly that, the loss of, for them, so I'm talking about the case of Ireland in the EU, the loss of that ability to turn to their UK counterparts, their UK colleagues for support and for, you know, for sounding board, whatever. So there's a real loss. I mean, I haven't yet looked into that in detail, but there is, you know, work on that. So lost the opportunities for elite socialization that came with shared EU membership. Each country's image has taken a hit in the other countries. I mean, most people would say, you know, if you read the research, that sort of perhaps matters less to France than the UK, but I can come back to that. And COVID as well very much constrained opportunities for refreshed public diplomacy, or diplomacy full stop. So the Lancaster House agreements were 10 years old in 2020. There was a very subdued celebration. Was it due to COVID? Was it due to, you know, the situation? Both, really. And diplomacy via political lead, like if you restrict diplomacy, or if you sort of narrow it to relations between political leaders and summitry, that has its obvious limits. It's very sort of up and down. The Biarritz summit, the G7 summit, was said last year to have been derailed by Brexit. And perhaps, they were still talking about our sort of conclusions on this relationship, you know, perhaps the FBBR is sort of less embedded in the political cultures of the two countries than the case of the US and the UK, or France and Germany, but I'm a bit tentative there. You know, the UK is Americanized, there's no doubt about that. Whether that means we'll always have a special relationship with the US at diplomatic level is a different question. Right. So there is a shared commitment at the political level to undertake the efforts required to conduct the relationship FBBR post-Brexit, certainly at operational level, but there are questions that remain. So I'll just sort of run through those and conclude. So to what, you know, I think we found ourselves asking, and we're asking as we look ahead, you know, to what extent do the two countries, France and Britain, sort of share a discourse, let alone a strategy on their place in the global order? There's a whole lot of things I could say here. We've managed one interview since this article with a senior UK official in the UK embassy in Paris, pointing to serious strains in the relationship and a really low point over, you remember the AUKUS deal last year. And others have written quite interestingly about how the fact that that deal seemed to come as a surprise to the French was actually a symptom of poor diplomatic sort of prospecting, poor diplomatic kind of grasp on the part of France. And perhaps the sort of the comforts of shared EU membership, perhaps something's been lost in terms of the way in which the two countries actually understand each other and are able to deal with each other now they're kind of other. And the same interviewee claims that since Ukraine, the relationship has improved, but there are clearly ongoing difficulties. So this is a question about, and again, there are other interesting articles that say France and Britain are very much the same, both sort of middling to small powers who sort of need the same thing from the world order, who have the same kind of approach to wanting room for maneuver and so on. But do they share, you know, do they want the same alliances? Do they share the same strategies? So, and how does that play into the relationship? You know, how far does the relationship even matter anymore? You know, that would be quite an interesting idea to pursue. You know, in the context of geopolitical challenges, it certainly matters to the individuals in the small boats on the small boats in the Channel, or for people for whom the loss of free movement is more than an administrative inconvenience, and it matters to the security of Europe. But perhaps it doesn't matter quite as much as the two sides think it does, and that's sort of, we'll see what's to play for. You know, and I suppose sort of that leads us to ask, well, are any diplomatic relationships immune to shifting geopolitical sands, and how to make them immune or how to make them resilient? Some research point in diplomacies, nothing original here, I don't think, points to the importance of a so-called all-society approach to diplomacy to create interdependence. one of our original interviewees called, sort of pointed to the sub-state and non-state tissue of bilateral relations, which kind of sustain the elite diplomatic effort, if you like, and said that there is a, quote, job of work to do. So in conclusion, yeah, there's good research still going on Franco-British diplomacy and cooperation. There's good research, I love it, the field of diplomatic studies per se, very, very interesting. Work's ongoing on the prospects of the European political community, and ahead of the Franco-British summit due to take place next year. And in fact, that event, I'm going to end here, the summit that may or may not take place next year, leads me to a sort of final couple of remarks, like back to the personal remarks about my future research agenda in this field. So first, it's actually been quite tricky getting interviews with all the, if I could put it politely, like the political churn, the comings and goings that's been going on in the UK political establishment, but also obviously in France with its elections, and especially on the issue of irregular migration, which is highly politicized. One of the interviews we spoke to just automatically talked about illegal migration. And when I said, it's more common in the literature to talk about irregular migration, he said, oh, I think that's just like an essay question, don't you, Helen? The difference between irregular and illegal, which kind of tells you a lot about the field that, how it's the politicization of it. So that was, it's not that we haven't tried to get interviews, we tried, and we're going to try again, but it's highly politicized. And then second, and finishing here, our university research, isn't it, is measured to an important extent by its impact, not necessarily on policy alone, but on debate, on communities, maybe on social change. And so my research for me does have meaning when it enlightens me, maybe others, hopefully others, on real world problems, so here diplomacy, and also when it results in fruitful cooperation with others. And I welcome ideas and thoughts on what you might deem impactful research. So I've just said why most academics still love doing their research, and we try to find impact. So I've explained why I think it's meaningful, but it would be interesting to hear maybe from others here around what impact might look like or in research in this field. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Yes, we could try that, couldn't we?
Try that. It saves us moving around, and we can ask questions. Or if anyone. Okay, so first, sorry, it might not work because
that's okay.
Yeah, okay. So we're here in the hybrid format, and we are going to ask a few questions. It might be easier if anybody does have a question from a virtual question, because we don't have to keep switching on and off the mics if you do. But if you haven't got a question prepared, we can kick off at this side, and you can then join in by either sending a message in the chat or asking to be unmuted. So I'm not seeing any questions coming up. Do any of the three of us want to kick off with a question? Nick, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I got Helen. It's quite interesting what you said about the resilience of relationships and being brought about by interdependency, essentially. Yeah. And I just wonder, how do you see the Franco-British relationship in those terms then? Because if on one hand, that interdependence has been not shattered, but greatly weakened by Brexit in terms of trade, etc., and nothing else. And on the other hand, you've still got a huge number of Brits living in areas of France. You've still got quite a large French population in the UK and a lot of intermarriages, etc. So do you think those factors will play upon, in other words, is there a sense in which, I suppose, in terms of socialization, ideationally, we are together and therefore we will stay together? And how much does that emotive ideation side matter as against pure trade, military cooperation, etc.?
Okay, I think I've got my sound on. That's a great question. I suppose time will tell. So obviously we didn't do that many interviews, but I couldn't help but notice, and it's perhaps not just in this case, that diplomats certainly talk the talk about how it's really important to have this tissue of ties between the two countries, and how precisely that the two sides had this sort of history going back, and as I talked about the chasse croisée, so they definitely talk the talk, but it's easy to see that there's not an awful, that's not really where the action takes place, certainly in terms of sort of state-to-state diplomacy. What is mattering is the trade, as you said, the security and commerce. I don't know. I mean, there's very good work done on the London French by Christian Lequesne at Sciences Po Paris. I did a little bit, but he's done something and published in 2020. But it is becoming harder for people to exercise, even if they have the right paperwork and what have you. It's not without its problems, is it? Mm. Certainly, and that's true in both cases. You know, there is a horrible limbo land. I could go into detail offline, but you know, there's a horrible limbo land for around residency and so on. And that's probably true for Brits, not just in France either. So I suppose my own, again, I realise that the heart has no place in research, does it? It's all about the head and so on, and we have to prove it. So time will tell in terms of what happens to the numbers of French nationals who still, so French for hire, the French come and work here, don't they? And the Brits have tended to spend their euro, in France, as you sort of mentioned. Time will tell. I think over and above, as I mentioned earlier, sort of inconvenience and so on, I do wonder whether Brexit has done something to sour relations. The fact that, so you have in the relationship, and we do write about this in the article, you've got the stereotypes, obviously, the roast beef and the what have you, and perfidious Albion. And I suppose those have been activated, or they've been reactivated. And certainly in the UK, media discourse, or certain media discourse, is very much sort of embellished and played on those tropes and so on. And I'm not sure that things will go back to before how they were before, actually. If I'm honest, I'm not. I do think that, the emotional side, the ideational side, I don't think it's left untouched. Because, and I suppose you could do a number of studies to sort of test that out. You could take areas, say, in the Alpine region, you could take like a demographic, young people who tend to work seasonally and so on, what's happened to them, or they don't get the, I'm speaking anecdotally, but it's true, there is evidence. They're not, it's harder for them to get the work. So what does that do then to the community that they used to be part of? I think it's partly about lost opportunities. And just to finish sort of on that question, there's some other work going on sport diplomacy and sort of the way in which the UK has to have, or if it doesn't have, a sort of a strategic, coherent sport diplomacy for its international kind of projection. Other countries are there already. So what I'm thinking about is the ties could be loosened, and then other ties form, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's a bit of a rambling answer to say that I do think that there's been an impact beyond the administrative, the economic. It affects people's well-being, or it affects people's feelings about home and place. Does that go some way to answering your question? I'd be interested to know what you think, if we've got time.
Yeah, we'll catch up that after.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Switch off for 1 second. David, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I can do it. There's nobody else in the room. Thanks for that. It's really fascinating. And inveterate Germanist here, so I'm going to have to ask something about the comparison with Germany, which it was interesting that you were saying you were working on that. I mean, I was recently at a visit by the German ambassador to Cardiff. And what struck me and I've seen a couple of German ambassadors speaking publicly about sort of Brexit related issues in the last couple of years, but this is the new ambassador. And what struck me very much about what he was saying was that, you know, he was talking about a number of issues around kind of mobility and students coming to the UK and why is it so difficult and why these visa fees and why and he was admittedly speaking in Cardiff and speaking to you know, a Labour-dominated Senate, you know, members of the Senate there. So I guess he felt he could be a little more critical than maybe if he was speaking in London. But I was very struck by the tone being very much one of wanting to kind of pull the UK back to certain sort of norms of how you treat your friends. The underlying tone was, you know, you're doing all these things to perfectly normal Germans who just want to come and spend their holidays in the UK or study at Cardiff University or the other universities in Wales, you know, and spend their money and do their business. And, you know, Wales is Germany's Wales's biggest export market. Why are you causing all these problems? And it was never said, but the underlying tone was, don't you know how to treat your friends? Do you find that in the French case as well, that the French are daring to put themselves in almost kind of like pedagogical tutorial role of saying, come on, UK, this is not how you behave?
Oh, that's a really, perhaps I haven't been party to such sort of candid discussions. That's certainly something that came up in the discussions I was talking about earlier last week with the Irish contingent. I mean, they were the Irish sort of team in the Netherlands. That I suppose when we had our interviews, they were quite guarded, maybe. And in some way, I haven't had the opportunity to have those candid discussions, and I would, yeah, I would very much like to. There has been, I think what I would say is I'd refer back to something I said earlier, which was around this sort of lack of sentiment, the way in which I think maybe because the relationship, the Franco-British relationship, perhaps it has a more competitive nature than, and the nature, you could say, of sort of the French public administration and so on. What we came across, or what was sort of explained, was almost like a lack of emotion, lack of sentiment, and a desire to kind of get on with the strategy, and to try to cohere over strategy. Whereas the British side, as we know, you know, the British sort of, was it under Johnson, or even though Theresa May tried to do thought that they could do bilateral deals, and that the friends would be friends again. I told you so. It was fairly inevitable, wasn't it? I think. And that seems to have taken the UK by surprise. But the pedagogical side, yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that I'd like to follow up. I'm quite, you know, I do want to get back into these sort of interviews. I don't know whether there's Schadenfreude but it's not really there. You know, there's the Brexit is experienced as a loss. And although the UK and the French have often sort of clashed in the council or whatever and have been at odds, there's also areas where they're very much in agreement. So now you see the extra European, the EPC and so on, sort of with both sides really wanting to, on the face of it, be together and work together. So it's not all sort of roses for the UK, for France, for the UK to have left. Perhaps they see some marginal gains in a way, you know, it's different. Perhaps it's different from the relationship with Germany, but that's a really interesting question that I'll look out for. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, sorry, I should have added is that that's been sort of written about is how at the time of Brexit, and I mentioned earlier the sort of idea that perhaps French diplomacy wasn't as sharp around, I mean British diplomacy, I think we can maybe agree that, you know, it perhaps didn't predict what might happen, but even on the French side, and there's some sort of criticism of the ambassadors, was it Catherine Colonna and her predecessor, that they'd almost sort of allowed or tapped into sort of English bashing, and that Colonna in particular, when she was in post, had not really done what one also described as quiet diplomacy, but rather kind of resorted to Twitter diplomacy. That was in COVID, but, you know, so so I'm not sure France is in a great position to do the pedagogy or to give the lessons. It's a very long-winded and another rambling answer. Yes, thank you. Oh, yeah.
So I'm just, I'm going to open to the floor before I ask any questions of my own, but does anybody want, I can unmute you, that may be easier than actually writing a question. I mean, feel free, I mean, Helen is a very approachable person. She will not be offended if anybody, John or Andrew or Tamayo, any of you, Nadir, if you've got, oh, you've got that, well, Nick's going to go for it. Okay, I'm going to say Nick.
Yeah, I mean, we have the great fortune of living in interesting times, and you mentioned you put a lot of emphasis on Brexit as being something that's strained the relationship, almost a breaking point from the way you're talking, but then you've got Ukraine on top of that, and to what sense has that brought back a feeling of we're part of a European continent, both in terms of security and of course in other areas, climate change, etc. There's got to be policy cooperation. It's nonsense to not have it. But I don't know, that doesn't seem to drive our government in that field though. But particularly with respect to Ukraine, to what extent has that counteracted, if you like, some of the dissension caused by Brexit between the two countries, the realization that they're on the same continent with the same security concerns?
I mean, it's certainly something that's come up. Oh, sorry. Yeah, well done. Is that right? Yeah. So it's certainly something that was mentioned in the as we tried to sort of conduct the next set of interviews, that Ukraine has been a turning point and a turning point for the better. It's almost like, oh, right, we know how to do this. So I mean, but that's not really what you were asking, were you? You're asking whether it's I think you were asking whether it's revived or reset the relationship around notions of values and shared values. I'm not quite so sure. I think yeah, I suppose they do speak the same language in that regard, but then you've got like the integrated review, you know, the Global Britain kind of sitting there, and that's about to be updated, and that says a lot of other things. So it remains to be seen, but on the face of it, it certainly, as to the extent that we've got a sort of first-hand insight into it, it seems to have breathed life into the relationship and given a sigh of relief that this is something where the two sides can, if not feel the same, then be on the same side, going back to this taking sides again. So yeah. But there are going to be different, yes, and so far I suppose there have been relatively little differences if you compare France and Britain with France and Germany, for example. So far so good, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm perfectly willing to take questions from the audience as well. The first question I wanted to ask was, to what extent is there almost a kind of cultural or philosophical or ideational, that wasn't me, ideational difference between, on the one hand, if you like, the French, the Cartesian, logical, realpolitik driven French on the one hand, and Brexit-led governments who operate on the margins of the irrational at times. I'm not talking about the elite policymakers, but I'm talking about their political masters. To what extent has that been an issue? Almost in some ways an issue of head and heart, or heart and head, and almost an issue of amateurism at times versus professionalism. So that's my first question. I think I'll leave it and I'll ask you another question, which is an even longer one in a second, okay?
It's hard to get away from the sort of the observations that are made that the UK does seem to have lost its way, which kind of is a short way to answer your question, really. I mean, I referred earlier to the criticisms and the critiques that can be made of French diplomacy in the case of the UK, as in, why didn't they see it coming? Have they got too close, too cozy? What was lost maybe through the socialization within Europe? Or were there other reasons why France perhaps didn't anticipate in the same way that the UK didn't? So it's not all one way, but and also France is sort of quite turbulent really at the moment too, you know, France in the way that the discourse around security in general and securitization of migration in particular is getting ever tighter. So perhaps I would just sort of tweak the premise of your question around the extent to which these sort of stereotypical approaches, and also France is having, you know, well, no, not, you know, but Macron has also initiated quite a lot of reform in this wonderful Cartesian administrative setup, including in the Quai d'Orsay itself, you know, his sort of, under his sort of heading into his second mandate, has initiated reforms to, as the critics would say it, sort of despecialize, that's a terrible word, isn't it? You know, the Quai d'Orsay, and make, and Jeremy Hunt, when in one of his previous incarnations, I've lost track, but when he was Foreign Secretary here, did talk about bringing sort of fresh blood and sort of other, opening up the diplomatic career to different, to business people, and which diplomacy already includes, as I said earlier, other actors. And France is not immune to that sort of, its critics will see it as an onslaught to what was a perfectly rational and functioning system. So maybe the two sides are not quite so far apart, but the extent to which the UK is having a collective nervous breakdown, as has been said in private, you know, by, is perhaps more pronounced.
One last question from me. And I'm just trying to work out if there's a way forward which is a happy ending or a less unhappy ending. And if you, I had a dissertation student last year, and we started to look together at, if you like, trauma in relationships between states, and how do you, so you said quite a bit about how you define shock and so on, but how do you get back on track? So, and what is the scale of the trauma that can be overcome? So if it's Korea, and you have the Korean War, and the country is partitioned and so on, and who knows how long it would take to rebuild that country, and there will be other, you know, other analogies and examples to be drawn on. Do you have a sense in which how long it would take if you were a doctor trying to diagnose, you know, the problem and the cure? You know, you'll need to switch your mic back on that.
That's a great question. I'm not sure that my answer can really kind of match up to it. It reminded me of, is it Jared Diamond's work on national crisis and personal crisis, and I could go back at that, and he takes cases of different nations in crisis and how long, or how they went about rebuilding and so on. So there are, and you've obviously encountered work that points us to that. I mean, Korea, that's kind of off the scale, really, isn't it, compared to what we're looking at here? I would have thought. If you look at the current British ambassador, Mena Rawlings, if you look at her Twitter feed, again, as I say, I realise that Twitter makes me sound old anyway, but like even more so at the moment, then it looks like it's all sort of sweetness and light. You know, there's lots of interactions going on. For those who aren't here, I think there's an event going on in Cardiff this evening, and there's a bit of a build-up in the street outside. So if you look at her Twitter feed, you would perhaps, you could conclude, or you could surmise that the rebuilding has begun, whether it's, you know, commemorations of historical events, or interactions at mayoral level, support, Franco-British support for young leaders in both countries and so on. It all looks quite, you know, quite positive and rebuilding, but so yes, I think on the scale of trauma, I don't know, you know, what the scale would be, but I'm not sure I would use the word. I don't know. Yeah, it would be interesting to sort of problematize and operationalize the notion of trauma. we talk about generations, don't we? Yeah, that's interesting. You know, who knows what's going to happen? You know, if the UK enters a slightly more sane kind of relationship with the EU and things become easier, then perhaps it will be less of a trauma. You know, it will have been more of a blip, especially if, as you know, as was said earlier, if the two countries still make common ground, if anything comes of the European political cooperation, if the will is there to work together, then perhaps we shouldn't talk about trauma in this case. But that's an off-the-cuff answer, really.
I mean, I won't do it right, but I'm just wondering about the control of the Brexit wing and the European Research Group of the Conservative Party, and therefore their influence over the current government. I can't see how Brexit is going to get any softer.
No.
So presumably take an election and weaker position in the Conservative Party for anything to move forward.
Yeah. In my own view at the moment is the progress is taking place in tiny sort of increments. So, you know, Johnson was removed and what came after, or who came after, was pretty disastrous. But if you're, you know, if you take that view, so if you're of a certain view, then for any progress to happen, Boris Johnson had to stand down, you know, and then and now we have debates on, you know, mainstream media and so on about the cost of Brexit, you know, so the debate is shifting slowly. Obviously, the Labour Party here are very unwilling to contest what they see as the people's vote and so on, but things change. I suppose that's my answer. Things change, and they will change, but it won't. Yeah. Here it's a bit like, you know, I was going to say poor Theresa May. I don't know why I was it's like Theresa May who couldn't get her deal through, you know, through Parliament. It was all about the numbers, wasn't it? So it will be about the numbers, you know, the numbers in Parliament, and that's true in France as well. You know, we shouldn't overlook. It's a bit like, you know, so there's already worry, you know, Macron can't stand in 2024, who's going to replace him? What, Le Pen is no longer, she's only sort of totemic president, the, you know, leader of the party. How's that going to look at, you know, how's that going to play out in 2027? Therefore, perhaps we shouldn't only look at here in the UK, but also across the channel. There we are. Thank you.
So I think we're going to be closing things down. I am conscious that a lot of you sat through the whole event and were enthralled, but do any of you have a very last question? Or are you all free now to go away and watch the match? Right, I think on that note, I think we'll thank Helen Drake for coming, giving us the benefit of her insight, her research and her experience on the diplomatic front and her future career as a diplomat as well. So thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the audience. I know this has been a much rescheduled event. It hasn't been easy to host or to hold. So thank you and have a good evening. Okay, thank you. Yes.